August 6, 1945, 8:14 a.m., Tokyo. In a quiet lab on the grounds of the Riken Institute, a man sat alone at a metal table. Dr. Yoshio Nishina, Japan's top nuclear physicist, the man who had spent years telling generals that an American atomic bomb was impossible. His hands were still. His suit smelled faintly of smoke from last night's air raids. On the window frame, a thin line of ash had settled and never really left. Outside the lab, Tokyo sounded ordinary. Footsteps in the hallway, paper sliding across a clipboard, a kettle hissing somewhere down the corridor. Nothing urgent, nothing loud. Nishina adjusted his glasses and kept working the same math he had worked for 3 straight years. Uranium enrichment, thermal diffusion, how many grams of U-235 you could actually separate in wartime. He still believed the answer protected Japan. He still believed physics itself was a shield. Because if the fuel for a bomb couldn't be produced in wartime, then no one, not even America, could possibly build the bomb. At that exact moment, 8:14 a.m., over Hiroshima, the Enola Gay was already in position. Inside its bomb bay sat Little Boy, a gun-type fission weapon holding more highly enriched uranium than Nishina believed could exist anywhere on Earth in 1945. He didn't know it yet. But the world had already changed, and Japan had already lost something it hadn't even admitted was on the table. Time. This story isn't about the bomb going off, not the flash, not the fire. It's about what happened in the hours after, in a quiet room in Tokyo, when Japan's top physicist realized the truth no one wanted to say out loud. Not, we're in danger, not this is bad. It was worse. It was, we cannot win, ever. Because at 8:15 a.m., one city vanished, and by noon the math would show him something far more terrifying. America hadn't built a weapon, it had built an industry, and there was no equation in Japan that could compete with that. For 3 years, Dr. Yoshio Nishina had been the calm voice of reason inside Japan's frantic war machine. He wasn't a dreamer or a fanatic, he was a mathematician, and mathematics, he believed, had limits that even empires must obey. Since 1942, he had led Project NIGO, Japan's secret attempt to master atomic fission. The goal was simple on paper, impossible in practice. Separate the rare isotope uranium-235 from uranium-238. Only 7 parts in 100 were useful for a bomb. The rest, dead weight. To make one working weapon, you needed about 50 kilograms of pure U-235, 50 kilograms that nature had hidden inside tons of ordinary metal. That meant millions of mechanical separations, each one precise to a fraction of an atom. Nishina's team had tried everything they could build: thermal diffusion columns, small electromagnetic separators, each device the size of a filing cabinet, each producing grams, never kilograms. He would run the calculations again, scratching numbers onto thin government paper already reused on the back. At their best rate, Japan could make a few grams of enriched uranium a month. To reach bomb weight would take decades. That was why, in every report to the Imperial Army, Nishina repeated the same sentence. An atomic bomb is theoretically possible, but practically impossible during wartime. He wasn't lying to save resources. He truly believed it. Japan had brilliant scientists. It had dedication. But it no longer had copper, or electricity, or time. The cities were burning. Industry was dying faster than equations could be solved. Tokyo had been firebombed for months. Factories were piles of twisted steel. The laboratories at Riken survived mostly because the Allies didn't think a small physics lab could matter. They were right, in a tragic way. Still, the officers kept asking, could America be working on the same thing? Could they finish first? Nishina would smile politely and shake his head. Even America, he said, couldn't overcome physics. The isotope didn't care how rich you were. It would not separate faster just because your factories were bigger. In that, he was half right. He knew the numbers. He had studied under Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, understood the equations of fission as well as anyone alive. The science was sound, the limits were real, in theory, but he had missed something larger than any formula: scale. Japan's laboratories were built like temples, small, meticulous, silent. America's war industry was built like a storm. It could turn theory into production lines and hesitation into budgets. Still, in 1945, from Nishina's narrow room in Tokyo, those American factories were rumors carried across oceans. The Imperial Navy still claimed victories in bulletins. The radio spoke of honor and spirit. So when he told his students that no one could build an atomic bomb before the war ended, they believed him. So did he. He believed in logic. He believed in restraint. He believed that if a thing required infinite power, no human nation could attempt it. And above all, he believed Japan still had time, that America was bluffing, that the war, for all its pain, would end through exhaustion, not through apocalypse. He returned to his equations, thinking that physics would set the boundaries of madness. But what he couldn't see from that small room was that another kind of physics had already taken over, the physics of industry, where money replaces neutrons, and the chain reaction isn't in atoms but in factories. That belief, that the universe would protect him with its own difficulty, was about to collapse in a single minute of light. At 8:14 a.m., the limits he trusted still held. By 8:15 a.m., they would not exist. Because while he traced equations on paper, half a continent away, someone else had already solved the same problem not with theory, but with electricity and silver and 130 ASIN pairs of hands. The problem was never physics, it was production. And that morning, Dr. Yoshio Nishina's neat equations were about to be outnumbered. 8:15 a.m., Hiroshima, a flash brighter than the sun, then silence. In Tokyo, nobody knew yet. The city was still half asleep, heavy with the smell of ash and humidity. Radio operators chatted about supply convoys. Clerks walked to work under a gray, ordinary sky. 8:16 a.m. The first signal cut out. Hiroshima's broadcast ended mid-sentence. The station simply went silent. Minutes later, other lines failed. Army telegraphs, police relays, civilian switchboards. An entire city had stopped talking. At first, headquarters assumed another firebombing. Maybe an oil depot hit. Maybe sabotage. But the numbers coming in made no sense. Only 3 planes had been spotted. 3. B-29 raids usually came in hundreds. By 9 o'clock a.m., confusion turned to unease. Pilots over the region reported a white cloud rising far beyond storm height, 40,000 feet and still climbing. A light so bright it had cast shadows miles away. At 9:30, fragments of reports arrived from neighboring towns. People burned without flame. Buildings erased instead of collapsed. Glass melted like wax. Nishina sat at his desk listening. Each description hit like a calculation, a single explosion, a fireball temperature exceeding 3,000 degrees, a radius of complete vaporization, 2 kilometers. He didn't need to see the ruins. He knew what the math meant. The energy release matched only one possibility: fission. By 10 o'clock a.m., the Ministry of War demanded answers. Was it a new incendiary? A chemical weapon? Some miracle explosive? Nishina closed his notebook. He looked at the officer and said quietly, "No, this is different." He didn't finish the sentence. The man in uniform didn't understand anyway. At 11 o'clock a.m., he was summoned to the command center. On the drive across Tokyo, the streets looked like bones, buildings hollowed by fire, tram lines twisted. He saw people sweeping debris as if that could still matter. Inside the bunker, generals were shouting. Some said propaganda, some said trick. No one wanted the truth. But Nishina kept replaying the same numbers in his head: the light, the radius, the timing. To produce that kind of yield, 15 kilotons at least, you needed enriched uranium at roughly 80% purity. That meant tens of kilograms. That meant the impossible. He realized then, the Americans had done it. They hadn't just built a laboratory experiment. They had built a machine that made the impossible routine. By noon, Tokyo buzzed with panic beneath the silence. Engineers debated whether the weapon could be duplicated. Nishina already knew the answer. America had not achieved a scientific miracle. It had achieved industrial saturation. While Japan scraped together copper wires and glass tubing, America had built entire cities for this one purpose. He began to list them aloud, almost in disbelief. Oak Ridge, Tennessee. 825 acres of hidden factories, a place that didn't officially exist, 75,000 workers, more than 1,000 electromagnetic separators, called calutrons, humming day and night. They'd even borrowed 14,000 tons of silver from the U.S. Treasury to wind the coils, because copper was needed elsewhere. Hanford, Washington, Reactors in the desert, breeding plutonium from uranium, another path to the same end. 50,000 workers, Los Alamos, New Mexico. The design center, where equations turned into detonators. Nishina whispered the arithmetic. 3 cities, 1 purpose, 1 nation that had turned its own electricity grid into a weapon. He understood now that the bomb was not the invention. The factory was. Japan's entire nuclear program had fewer than 100 scientists. America's had 100,000 laborers before the scientists even entered the picture. By 1:00 p.m., reports from the south grew worse. No birds, no insects, no sound. Hiroshima had become a geometry of dust, a single plane, a single bomb, and 80,000 people gone in a second. The survivors spoke of shadows burned into stone. Nishina sat motionless. For the first time in the war, he wasn't thinking about atoms. He was thinking about ratios. If America could create 64 kilograms of uranium-235 for 1 bomb, and if their production ran continuously, they could make another in weeks. Perhaps 1 every month. There was no defense against that. No fighter could stop a single B-29 at that altitude. No bunker could withstand the heat. He wrote 1 sentence in his report. Continued resistance is mathematically futile. At 2:00 p.m., the Army demanded to know how long until America could strike again. He tried to comfort them, and himself. If they built one, it must have exhausted their supply, he said. Another will take months. He wanted to believe that. He needed to believe that, but somewhere inside, he knew he was lying, because the pattern was too clean, too efficient. This wasn't a miracle. It was a schedule. By 5:00 p.m., his colleagues returned from the first investigative flight over Hiroshima. Radiation meters clicked uncontrollably. The readings were unmistakable. Gamma, beta, alpha. They collected samples of greenish glass, melted sand fused by unimaginable heat. They measured isotopes that could only come from uranium fission. It was, beyond doubt, an atomic detonation. And when they compared the isotopic ratios, they realized the fuel was uranium-235, the very element Nishina had said no one could ever enrich fast enough. He stared at the figures. The Americans hadn't just solved the enrichment problem. They had industrialized it. That night, he returned to his lab and sat among the silent thermal diffusion columns, the fragile, glass-walled machines that had been his life's work. He ran the numbers again, slowly, methodically, as if somewhere a decimal might change the outcome. If the Americans had reached 80% purity, and if they had done so within 2 years, their plants must have been 1,000 times larger than his. 1,000 times. That number, not the explosion, broke him. It meant Japan had never been in the race. It had been running in place while an entire continent turned physics into policy. By midnight, the truth was absolute. The bomb was terrifying, yes, but the industry that made it was unstoppable. Not 50 engineers, not a handful of geniuses, 75,000 workers in one city, 50,000 in another, hundreds of thousands more in supply chains, each man and woman unknowingly turning levers, refining metal, feeding a machine that would erase a nation. It wasn't panic, it was arithmetic. And for the first time, Dr. Yoshio Nishina stopped believing in physics. He started believing in production. August 8, 1945, Tokyo. The door was closed, the blinds were drawn. No reporters, no stenographers, no record that could be played back later in a trial, only officers, and a scientist who had finally run out of ways to soften the truth. The room smelled like wet wool and cigarette smoke. There was a single lamp over the table, yellow and tired. Outside, somewhere in the city, someone was hammering sheet metal back into the frame of a burned house. No one in that room raised their voice. On the table, maps of Western Honshu, circles sketched in red grease pencil around what used to be Hiroshima. Blast radius, fire radius, total destruction radius. Under that, a typed sheet of raw figures, yield, altitude of detonation, estimated temperature, radiation levels still lethal hours after the blast. And beside that, the part that should not have existed, a projection. How many more can they build? That question stayed in the air for a long time. An army colonel tried first. He said what men in uniform always say in front of power. This weapon may be terrible, but America's bluffing. They have won. They fired it. They want us scared. Another officer nodded. If we endure, they'll hesitate. They don't have the stomach to burn every city. We still negotiate from strength. Honor, face, words that had been repeated for years. Nishina didn't answer right away. He didn't shout. He didn't pound the table. He didn't talk like a man arguing for policy. He talked like a man reading an autopsy. He slid one page forward. Oak Ridge. He slid another. Hanford. Numbers, acreage, head count, electrical load. 75,000 workers at one site alone, he said quietly. Silence. These are not laboratories, he said. These are cities, built only to separate uranium, built only to feed one weapon. He tapped the page again. They are not doing this once. The colonel across the table tried to push back. How long until they could attack again? If they have to rebuild their material from nothing, we have time. Weeks, months. The emperor can still demand terms. It was almost hopeful. Nishina shook his head. They do not need to rebuild, he said. He pointed to another figure. Production flow, not experiment logs, not research, output. This is continuous, he said. Not experimental. Continuous. The room shifted. Nobody took notes now. He drew a breath. His hand, for the first time, wasn't steady. We thought, he said slowly, that the bomb was the impossible part. He looked up. It isn't. He let that hang. The impossible part, he said, is matching the industry that makes it. No one spoke. Because that sentence wasn't about Hiroshima anymore. It was about Tokyo, Osaka, Nagasaki, Sapporo. It was about the map in front of them and which red circle would be real next. Someone, an older general with a neat uniform and eyes that hadn't slept, tried to steer it back to pride. We cannot surrender, he muttered. It would shame the dead. Nishina turned his head and looked at him. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. They are not threatening to destroy our army, he said. They are threatening to remove our cities, one by one. On schedule. That word, schedule, did more damage than destroy. War, until that moment, still had shape. You lose ground, you pull back, you counterattack, you bleed, and maybe you recover. This was not that kind of war anymore. This was manufacturing. You don't understand, one of the younger aides said, barely above a breath. This means there is no battlefield. Nishina nodded. There is no battlefield, he repeated. Only targets. Then he said the sentence that froze the room. It's over. He didn't say, we are in danger. He didn't say, we must act fast. He didn't even say, we have lost Hiroshima. He said, very simply, like a number on a page, it's over. The colonel across from him swallowed. You mean Hiroshima is over? Nishina didn't blink. No, he said. I mean, the war. That landed like a physical hit. In every war meeting before this one, there had always been at least one fantasy left. Hidden reinforcements, secret weapons, an ally about to intervene. Now, for the first time, there was nothing. Not strategy, not breakthrough, not even hope packaged as myth, just math. He laid out the last piece, the one none of them had wanted to say aloud. If we continue, he said, we are no longer fighting to defend Japan. We are fighting to protect the idea that we are still in control. He let that sit. In reality, he said, we're only deciding how many more cities we're willing to watch vanish before we admit the truth we already know today. No one interrupted him. Because everyone in that room understood what that meant. The honor they kept talking about wasn't honor anymore. It was ego, obedience, ritual suicide just stretched over whole populations. One of the officers finally whispered it, almost to himself. So we can't win, he said. Nishina looked back down at the map. We can only decide how long it takes to die, he said. That was the moment. That was the break. That was the second the war, for them, stopped being glory and became arithmetic. And in that quiet room in Tokyo, Japan finally knew. August 9, 1945, 11:02 a.m., Nagasaki. Another flash, another city erased, but this time Nishina didn't need reports. He didn't need Geiger counters or lab samples. He already knew what the numbers meant, and this time they were worse. Because Fat Man wasn't uranium, it was plutonium. A different element, a different design, a different factory. That meant America hadn't just built one path to destruction, it had built two. While Japan struggled to purify a few grams of uranium, America had been running entire reactors, breeding new fuel by the ton. The dream of catching up was gone, so was the illusion of time. That same morning, while Tokyo still reeled from Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. A second front, a knife in the back of a corpse that was still pretending to breathe. By afternoon, the Supreme War Council, the Big Six, gathered. The emperor's advisors, generals, ministers, they argued about surrender, conditions, pride. Nishina's report was already on the table. 3 pages, cold, precise. It said, "The enemy possesses not a single weapon, but a production capability capable of continuous output. Further resistance serves no strategic purpose. Continued war equals extermination." The sentence terrified them more than the bombs, because the math was final. No defense system could stop a B-29 at 30,000 feet. No radar could intercept a bomb that erased the concept of battle itself. Still, in the palace, there were voices insisting on honor. We must die before we surrender. We must make the Americans bleed one last time. But even those voices were quieter now. The emperor was told of the radiation. The cities glowing in the dark. The hospitals overflowing with burns that could not be treated, men whose skin came off when doctors touched them, women who had lived through the blast but not the week after. It wasn't just Hiroshima anymore. It was the proof of repetition, and repetition was industrial, predictable, scheduled. The Americans could do this every few days, as long as they chose to keep the factories running. That was the real terror, not the mushroom cloud, but the knowledge that the next one was already in production. By the evening of August 9th, the argument was finished. The room that had been so loud for years fell silent. The war had turned from strategy to logistics, and logistics had spoken. When Japan surrendered days later, most of the world saw it as the end of the atomic age's beginning. For Nishina, it was something else entirely, a scientific humiliation too perfect to be denied. After the occupation began, American physicists visited his lab. They came politely, curious, even respectful. They walked among his fragile thermal diffusion columns, looked at his small cyclotron, and tried not to show the pity in their faces. One of them, a young American, said kindly, "Your method was sound. We used the same principle at Oak Ridge." It was true. The science had been right. The theory had been elegant. It just hadn't been large enough. Japan had approached the bomb as a problem of knowledge. America had treated it as a problem of resources, and resources had won. Nishina wrote about that later. Quietly, privately, he called it the arrogance of equation. He said he had assumed that limits of theory were the limits of action, that if something required impossible effort, no one would ever attempt it. He had been wrong. Because in modern war, the side willing to industrialize madness will always defeat the side that waits for reason. The Americans had spent $2 billion, employed 130,000 people, built entire secret cities that did not exist on maps, all to make one weapon work, and then to make more. Japan, by comparison, had spent less than the cost of a single bomber squadron, fewer than 100 researchers, no heavy industry left to support them. The difference wasn't science, it was civilization. Nishina understood that too late, and it haunted him. He kept teaching after the war, trying to rebuild the scientific community in a ruined country. But he never spoke about August 6th in public again. He died in 1951, not disgraced, but not proud either. In his final notes, found after his death, he wrote one last line. The physics was never the enemy, the factory was. It was his confession and his epitaph. Because the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima had been built by engineers he would have admired, men who loved precision and order, and the machine that destroyed Japan wasn't a secret formula, it was an assembly line. The war had ended, but its lesson remained. In the age of industry, genius means nothing without scale, and morality means nothing once production has momentum. That was the cost, not just 2 cities, But the idea that intelligence alone could save a nation, it couldn't, not anymore. They called it science, they called it victory, they called it necessary. But when you count the numbers, the factories, the workers, the cities built to erase other cities, it stops sounding like progress. It starts sounding like a machine that discovered it could feed on itself. Oak Ridge, Hanford, Los Alamos, 3 names that never appeared on a single map during the war. 3 cities built only to prove that impossible was just another word for not yet industrialized. 130,000 workers, 14,000 tons of borrowed silver, entire power grids drained dry to split one atom faster. That wasn't genius, that was will. Refined, multiplied, mechanized. And once a nation learns how to turn that will into an industry, what defense does anyone else really have? Dr. Yoshio Nishina spent his life chasing elegance. Clean equations, balanced energy, the idea that knowledge itself had morality. But Hiroshima proved otherwise. It proved that intelligence without restraint is just another form of force. The bomb was not the end of science, it was its industrialization. And that morning in Tokyo, in the quiet lab where he once believed theory would protect the world, a man of numbers learned a truth that no formula could forgive. It wasn't that America had outsmarted Japan. It had simply outbuilt it, on a scale so vast that the difference between genius and machinery became meaningless. He realized too late that the atom had never been the danger. The factory was. Listen to the silence between the explosions, the hum of a power line feeding the next reaction, the rhythm of production replacing thought. That's the real sound of modern war. They said it was a triumph of science, but science doesn't choose targets, people do. And once people learn to mass-produce annihilation, the question stops being, can we? And becomes, will we ever stop? So tell me, when a nation measures its pride in megawatts and ash, is that brilliance, or is that a new kind of cruelty? History remembers the flash over Hiroshima. Almost no one remembers the quiet room in Tokyo where a man whispered, "It's over." And he was right. It was.